The winter of 1873 came down on the Dakota prairie like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, but a sudden, violent freezing of the world. The wind, born in the barren lands of the north, traveled for 1,000 miles without a tree to slow it. And when it hit the small settlement of Prairie Ridge, it struck like a physical blow. It was a cold that did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest log walls, found the smallest gaps in the chinking, and breathed its frost onto the inside of every cabin. It was a thief that stole the heat from a hearth almost as fast as a man could feed it wood. The settlers of Prairie Ridge were hardy folk, accustomed to hardship, but this was different. This was a cold that felt personal, an active malevolence in the air. They had built their cabins the way their fathers had, the way they had been taught back east. Strong logs, notched and fitted, with mud and moss packed into the seams. A stone fireplace at one end, a door at the other, and 2 small windows with wooden shutters, or, for the more prosperous, precious panes of glass shipped all the way from St. Louis. These were the homes that had tamed other frontiers, the very picture of pioneer strength. But here, on the treeless, wind-swept plains, they were failing. The cold laid siege to them. Inside the cabin of John Miller, the patriarch of the settlement, frost grew in delicate fern-like patterns on the walls, just feet from a roaring fire. His wife, Martha, was constantly draping quilts over the window frames, but the draft came through like a knife, chilling the very air they breathed. They burned through their winter woodpile at a terrifying rate. By December, John was already eyeing the lone cottonwoods down by the creek, trees he had sworn to leave standing. It was the same in every home. Children were kept bundled and close to the fire, their faces flushed from the heat on one side and chilled on the other. The constant, gnawing anxiety was a quiet guest at every meal. The question was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air with their frozen breath. How do you fight an enemy that lives inside your own walls? In this small community of shared struggle, there was one who was more alone than the rest. Ilara, a widow for just over a year, lived at the edge of the settlement with her 7-year-old son, Samuel. Her husband, a quiet man named David, had been a railroad surveyor, a man of books and calculations who had seen more of the world than anyone in Prairie Ridge. He had died of a fever the previous spring, leaving Ilara with a small plot of land, a half-finished cabin of the standard design, and a collection of notebooks filled with his precise, angular handwriting. The community pitied her. A lone woman with a young boy, facing a Dakota winter. It was a death sentence, they whispered. But Ilara was not idle in her grief. She spent the summer and autumn not finishing the log cabin David had started, but dismantling it. The neighbors watched, perplexed. She took the logs and stacked them neatly. Then she began to dig. With a spade and a wheelbarrow, she excavated a wide, shallow pit, 4 feet deep, where the cabin was meant to stand. The men of the settlement, taking a break from their own winter preparations, would sometimes wander over. Thomas, the most respected builder among them, a man whose cabin corners were famously tight, leaned on the handle of his axe and watched her. "A cellar, missus?" he asked, not unkindly. "A bit large for a root cellar, is it not?" Ilara pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, her hands caked in dirt. "It is not a cellar, Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is a foundation." He squinted, looking at the hole in the ground, then at the empty prairie around them. "A foundation for what? A tomb?" The other men who had gathered chuckled. The idea was absurd. You built a cabin on the land, not in it. You built it high to stay out of the snow and the mud. Everyone knew that. She ignored the laughter. In the evenings, by the light of a tallow lamp, she did not weep. She studied her late husband's notebooks. David had been a meticulous observer. He had drawn diagrams of sod houses he had seen among the German immigrants in Nebraska. He had sketched the winter homes of the Plains tribes, the earth lodges built into the sides of riverbanks. He had made notes on something he had read about in a book from Europe, a Russian stove, a great mass of brick and clay built in the center of a room, designed to hold its heat for hours. His notes were not just observations, they were calculations. He wrote of thermal mass, of the insulating properties of packed earth and trapped air, of how the wind's power could be broken by a low, rounded profile. From these pages, Ilara formed her plan. It was a strange and alien thing, a creature of necessity stitched together from the wisdom of others. Her cabin would have no windows of glass. It would have almost no wood in its walls. It would be a creature of the earth itself. When she explained her idea to Thomas, who had come to offer his help in raising a proper wall before the first snow, he simply shook his head. No windows? A house of mud? Woman, you will bury yourself and the boy alive. The walls will weep with damp, the roof will collapse, and you will have no light. It is a foolish dream. The community's reaction was swift and uniform. It began with concerned warnings, which, when unheeded, turned to mockery. They called her new home Ilara's Folly. The children, mimicking their parents, called it the mole hole. They saw her cutting the prairie sod into thick, rectangular bricks, the grass still clinging to the rich, black earth. They watched her mix clay from the creek bed with dried prairie grass to make a crude mortar. They saw her laying these heavy bricks, one on top of another, building up the walls from the floor of her excavation. It was slow, back-breaking work, and it looked nothing like the clean, proud lines of a log cabin. It looked primitive, desperate. Her plan for light was the subject of the most intense ridicule. Lacking glass, and understanding that even a shuttered opening was a gaping wound for heat to escape through, she prepared several hides of deer David had hunted. She scraped them thin, painstakingly, until they were almost translucent. Then, following a half-remembered passage from one of his books, she spent days rubbing them with rendered animal fat, working it into the hide until it became pliable and waterproof. These she intended to stretch across two small openings high on the south-facing wall. Oiled rawhide for windows. When word of this spread through the settlement, the laughter was no longer suppressed. It was open and derisive. "She means to live in a drum," one man said, to guffaws at the small trading post. "The first blizzard will tear them to shreds." Ilara heard the whispers. She saw the pointed fingers and the pitying glances. It was a heavy burden, another layer of cold to endure. But the memory of the previous winter in their half-finished cabin, of Samuel's constant hacking cough, and the feeling of never, ever being truly warm, was a sharper spur than any mockery. Her husband's notebooks were her scripture, and his quiet confidence, still alive in the ink on the page, was her shield. She was not driven by pride or a desire to prove them wrong. She was driven by the simple, fierce calculus of a mother protecting her child. The cold was coming, and she would not let it have him. So she worked, alone. From sunrise to sunset, the rhythm of her days was the thud of the spade, the scrape of the trowel, the grunt of lifting another sod brick into place. Samuel, too small to lift the heavy bricks, did what he could. He brought her water from the creek. He gathered bundles of the long prairie grass she used for her mortar mix. He sat inside the rising walls, out of the wind, and watched his mother build their fortress, his small face serious and trusting. He never questioned her. For him, what his mother did was simply right. The work was a slow, deliberate prayer against the coming winter. She laid two walls, not one, an outer wall of sod, 3 feet thick, and an inner wall, a foot thick, with a gap of several inches between them. This gap, David's notes had explained, was crucial. She packed it loosely with the driest grass she could find. "Trapped air," he had written, "is the best insulation of all. It does not move, so it cannot steal heat." The walls rose slowly from the earth, not soaring into the sky, but hugging the ground, as if growing from it. The top of the finished walls was only 4 feet above the level of the prairie. The structure did not fight the wind, it crouched beneath it. As autumn deepened and the air grew crisp, the contrast between her labor and the work of the community became stark. Her neighbors had long since finished their winter preparations. Their cabins were chinked, their woodpiles were high, and their windows were shuttered against the biting wind. They looked at her unfinished earth mound with a mixture of pity and smug certainty. Thomas had finished building a new smokehouse, its log walls a testament to his skill, and he felt a pang of guilt watching the widow toil. He had offered, in good faith, to help her build a real cabin. She had refused, politely but absolutely. He had done his duty. Her foolishness was her own. The heart of her design was the stove. It was not the simple stone fireplace of her neighbors, a gaping maw that devoured wood and sent most of its heat straight up the chimney. Following David's detailed drawings, she built a labyrinth of brick and clay in the very center of the single room. It was a great, hulking mass, with a small firebox at the bottom and a long, winding flue that snaked back and forth through the masonry core before it ever reached the roof. The principle was simple. The hot smoke would be forced to travel a long and tortuous path, giving up its heat to the clay and brick mass along the way. The stove itself would become a giant, gentle radiator, warming the air long after the fire had died down. It took her weeks to build, fitting each brick, plastering each seam with her clay mortar. When it was done, it looked like a crude altar in the center of her sunken room. Finally, she laid the roof. She used the logs from the dismantled cabin as rafters, laying them close together. On top of these, she layered thick bundles of prairie grass, and then, finally, the same sod bricks she had used for the walls, packed tight and graded to shed water. The final structure was less a house and more a feature of the landscape, a small grassy hillock on the vast, flat prairie. The only signs of human habitation were a single, sturdy door made from the thickest planks she had, and the 2 strange, translucent squares on the south-facing wall. They glowed with a dull amber light, the oiled rawhide stretched tight and pegged into wooden frames. She finished just as the first flurries of snow began to drift from a leaden sky. Her woodpile was small, less than half the size of her neighbor's. Thomas, passing by on his way back from the creek, saw it and shook his head once more. "She will not last the month," he muttered to himself. The mockery had faded now, replaced by a grim, communal certainty. They were no longer laughing. They were simply waiting for the inevitable, tragic end to the strange story of Alara's folly. The great storm arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar. It began in the middle of the night, a week before Christmas. The wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, rose to a primal scream. It was a solid wall of moving air and ice, a force that shook the sturdiest log cabins to their foundations. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring blizzard that erased the world, burying fences and paths in minutes. The temperature plummeted. It dropped past 0, past 10 below, settling into a realm of cold that was no longer a number on a thermometer, but a predatory, living thing. Inside the Miller cabin, the storm was a deafening assault. The wind howled in the chimney, making the fire dance and spit. It shrieked through the tiny cracks in the walls, each one a needle of ice. Martha had hung every blanket they owned over the walls, but the cold bled through them. The family was huddled together on the hearth, wrapped in quilts, but the side of them facing away from the fire was numb with cold. John was feeding logs into the fireplace every 20 minutes, his movements frantic. He could see his breath in the corners of the room. The precious glass pane in their one real window was a sheet of thick, opaque ice. The cold was winning. It was inside with them. In another cabin, a younger family with a newborn baby was fighting a more desperate battle. Their chinking, hastily applied in the autumn, had failed. The wind was blowing fine, powdery snow directly into their single room, dusting their sleeping pallets and furniture. The mother wept silently as she held her baby, trying to warm it with her own body heat, terrified the infant's shallow breaths would simply freeze in the air. Her husband was outside, in the teeth of the gale, trying to stuff rags into the gaps, his hands so cold he could no longer feel his fingers. He was risking his life for a task that was already hopeless. The situation was the same across Prairie Ridge. The settlement, which had seemed so robust in the autumn sun, was being dismantled by the storm. The traditional methods, the tried and true wisdom of their fathers, were proving to be a fatal inheritance. The cabins were acting like sieves designed to leak heat into the Arctic air. The massive fireplaces, sources of comfort and pride, were now insatiable monsters, their powerful drafts sucking the warm air out of the rooms as quickly as it was generated, pulling in more icy air through 100 tiny cracks. The settlers were trapped in their failing shelters, burning through their lifeblood of firewood, growing colder and more desperate with every passing hour. But at the edge of the settlement, in the low, snow-covered mound they called Elara's Folly, there was a profound and unnerving silence. Outside, the blizzard raged with the sound of a universe tearing apart. But inside Elara's home, the sound was a distant, muffled hum, the anger of a beast locked outside the door. The thick earth and sod walls, now piled high with an insulating blanket of snow, absorbed the wind's fury completely. There were no drafts, not a single whistling crack. The air was still and calm. In the center of the room, the great masonry stove glowed with a gentle, radiant warmth. It was not the scorching, one-sided heat of a fireplace, but an even, pervasive comfort that filled the entire space. Elara had put 3 small logs into its firebox that morning. The fire was now little more than a bed of glowing coals, but the massive brick structure around it had soaked up the heat and was now releasing it slowly, steadily, into the room. The temperature was a stable, comfortable 60 degrees. Elara sat at her small wooden table, mending one of Samuel's shirts by the light of a single candle. Samuel himself was asleep on his cot, breathing deeply and evenly, a picture of peaceful warmth. The 2 rawhide windows, which had been the source of so much ridicule, were performing their function perfectly. They did not offer a clear view of the storm, but they were not meant to. They captured the diffuse, white glare of the blizzard and transformed it into a soft, restful, amber glow that filled the small cabin. They were not cold to the touch. The oiled hide, stretched taut, vibrated slightly with the worst of the wind's gusts, but it held firm. It was a window that let in light, but not the cold. It was a marvel. The home was a sanctuary. It was a quiet, warm, and utterly safe haven in the heart of the maelstrom. It worked. For 2 days and 2 nights, the storm did not relent. It was a siege without pause. In the main settlement, hope began to curdle into despair. The millers ran out of firewood on the 2nd night. John, his face grim and set, began to break up a wooden chest for fuel. It was a desperate act, burning the very things that made a home, and they both knew it. In Thomas's cabin, the situation was just as dire. As the master builder, his home was better constructed than most, but even his tight-fitting logs could not defeat this enemy. His youngest daughter had developed a fever, her small body shivering uncontrollably, despite being wrapped in every scrap of wool and fur they owned. The water in the bucket by the door was frozen solid. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a predator, stalking his family in their own home. Thomas was a proud man, but his pride was a poor shield against the cold that was threatening to steal his child's life. He thought of the widow, Ilara. He had been so certain of her failure. He had pictured her and the boy, frozen in their damp, dark hole in the ground. But a sliver of doubt, planted by the sheer, stubborn strangeness of her design, had taken root. What if she had not been a fool? What if she had been wise? The thought was an agony to his pride, but the sound of his daughter's labored breathing was a far greater torment. He made a decision. He would not let his family freeze because he had been too proud to admit he might be wrong. Wrapping himself in his heaviest coat and pulling a scarf over his face, he opened the cabin door. The wind tore it from his grasp and slammed it against the wall. The blizzard was a physical entity, a white chaos that stole his breath and blinded him. He fought his way out, pulling the door shut against the storm's invasion. He could barely see 5 feet in front of him. The journey to Ilara's home, a walk of less than 200 yards, was now a perilous expedition across a frozen, alien landscape. He navigated by instinct, his head down, pushing against the crushing force of the wind. Snow filled his eyes and beard, and the cold burned his exposed skin like fire. He stumbled and fell, losing all sense of direction. For a moment, he felt a wave of utter hopelessness. This was how people died on the prairie, lost in a white wilderness just steps from their own door. But the image of his sick daughter pushed him back to his feet. He staggered on, one agonizing step at a time. He almost missed it. The mound of her home was so completely buried in snow that it was nearly invisible, just another drift in the churning landscape. Only the thin plume of smoke, whipped instantly away by the wind, gave it away. He stumbled toward the door, his limbs heavy and numb, and pounded on the thick wood with a frozen fist. He did not know what he expected. Silence, perhaps, or a weak, dying cry for help. The door opened. Ilara stood there, holding a candle. Behind her, a wave of calm, steady warmth washed over him, a physical shock so profound it almost buckled his knees. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a roaring fire, but a gentle, humid warmth that felt like life itself. He stared past her into the small, amber-lit room. He saw the boy, Samuel, sleeping peacefully in his bed. He saw no frost on the walls. He saw no frantic activity, no desperate struggle. He saw only a deep, abiding calm. The air did not smell of damp earth, as he had predicted, but of warm bread and wood smoke. It was a sanctuary. He was wrong. He was so completely, devastatingly wrong. Ilara looked at the man before her, a figure of snow and ice, his face a mask of shock and desperation. She saw not the man who had mocked her, but a neighbor in need, a father terrified for his child. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. Her triumph was not in his defeat, but in the simple fact that her son was warm and safe. She simply stepped aside. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm and even. "Come in. Bring your family." He could only stammer, his frozen lips barely able to form the words. "My daughter. She is sick. We are freezing." He looked around the impossible room again, his builder's eye trying to comprehend what he was seeing, what he was feeling. The sheer, massive bulk of the central stove, radiating its gentle heat. The smooth, dry clay walls. The soft light filtering through the rawhide. It was a different world. He had built a house to fight the prairie, a rigid, proud thing of wood and right angles. She had built a shelter that yielded to it, that borrowed its strength, that was a part of the earth itself. Within the hour, Thomas had brought his family to Ilara's home. His wife, her face etched with fear, carried their sick daughter, wrapping her in a quilt. As they stepped across the threshold, their reaction was the same as his. A moment of stunned silence, followed by a wave of profound relief. The little girl, who had been shivering violently, seemed to relax almost immediately in the steady warmth. Ilara gave them hot broth and made a place for them near the stove. The small cabin was crowded now, but it was a haven of shared life in the middle of a storm that dealt only in death. Thomas sat on a small stool, saying nothing, simply watching Ilara as she moved about the room with a quiet, unhurried grace. He was witnessing the complete and total demolition of his own certainty, and in its place, a growing sense of awe. When the storm finally broke on the third day, the world was remade. It was a landscape of brilliant, blinding white under a sky of piercing blue. The settlement of Prairie Ridge was half buried, the cabins looking like small, dark islands in a sea of snow. From Ilara's low mound, a path was dug, and word began to spread. It was carried first by Thomas, who returned to his own frigid cabin not with shame, but with a message. He went from door to door, to the homes of those who had run out of wood, whose families were sick with cold. "Go to the widow's house," he told them, his voice heavy with a new and unfamiliar humility. "Go and see." They came, first in ones and twos, then in small family groups. They trudged through the deep snow, their faces skeptical and grim. Each one of them stopped at the doorway, just as Thomas had, struck silent by the impossible wave of warmth that greeted them. They stepped inside, their eyes wide, and saw the proof of their own folly and her quiet wisdom. They saw the sleeping children, the glowing stove, the soft light from the hide windows. They saw a space that was not just surviving the winter, but was comfortable, even cozy. The men who had laughed the loudest were the quietest now. They looked at the construction, touching the dry interior walls, feeling the heat radiate from the masonry, and a slow, dawning understanding began to replace a lifetime of ingrained tradition. The laughter had died, and in its place, a profound and solemn respect was being born. A few days later, after the immediate crisis had passed and families had returned to their own cold homes, Thomas came back to Ilara's cabin. He did not come with a group. He came alone. He stood at her door, hat in hand, and for a long moment he did not speak. He was the master builder, the man whose opinion on such matters was law. He had led the chorus of doubt. Now he was here to surrender. "Ilara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. I was wrong. We were all wrong. We laughed at you, and we were freezing in our fine log houses while you and your boy were safe and warm in this miracle." He looked down at his worn boots, unable to meet her gaze. "I ask your forgiveness. But more than that," he said, finally looking up, his eyes clear and determined. "I ask you to teach me. Teach us all." Ilara looked at this proud man, now humbled, and saw the future of the community in his eyes. She felt no sense of victory, only a quiet satisfaction that the knowledge her husband had so painstakingly gathered would not die with him. It would live on, keeping other children warm, keeping other families safe. She nodded slowly. "There is no miracle, Thomas," she said softly. "Only good sense. Come, I will show you." And so, the education of Prairie Ridge began. She did not hoard her knowledge or ask for anything in return. She shared it freely, like bread. She took the men down into her home and explained the principles. She had them feel the thickness of the walls. "The earth is our warmest coat in winter and our coolest shade in summer," she explained, echoing a line from David's notes. "We should not build upon it, but within it." She showed them the gap between the inner and outer walls, filled with grass. "It is the still air that holds the warmth, not the log. A wall that cannot breathe cannot keep you warm. Her greatest lesson was the stove. The men gathered around the great masonry structure as she scraped away some of the clay plaster to show them the winding path of the flue. "A fire in an open hearth gives its heat to the sky," she said, tapping the warm brick. "This way, the fire gives its heat to the house first. It pays its rent before it leaves." She explained the concept of thermal mass, how the dense brick and clay stored the energy of a small, hot fire and released it for hours. They listened with the rapt attention of school children, their own hard-won expertise now seeming like childish ignorance. She showed them how she had treated the rawhide, explaining how the fat filled the pores, making it both waterproof and translucent. They touched the strange, glowing panels with a new reverence. They were not just windows. They were symbols of a new way of thinking. That spring, a great change came over the settlement. There was no grand meeting or formal decree. It happened organically, born of a shared, near-fatal experience and a newfound humility. The sound of saws and axes was replaced by the thud of spades and the scraping of shovels. All across Prairie Ridge, families began to build anew. They did not tear down their old cabins, but they began to augment them, or to build new shelters for the next winter, based entirely on Ilara's design. Thomas was her most dedicated student and her most ardent advocate. He worked alongside his neighbors, directing the excavation of new foundations, his old pride replaced by a craftsman's passion for a superior method. He helped them lay the sod bricks, showing them how to stagger the seams for strength. He supervised the construction of the new masonry stoves, his hands, once skilled only with wood, now learning the new language of brick and clay. The settlement was a hive of activity, but it was a different kind of work. It was quieter, more thoughtful. They were not just building walls, they were building security. They were building a future. The landscape of the settlement itself began to change, the tall, proud cabins giving way to low, earth-hugging homes that seemed to rise naturally from the prairie. The story of Prairie Ridge and its winter of transformation began to travel. A fur trader, passing through the next summer, was astonished by the sight of the strange new village. He stayed for a night, felt the cool, even temperature inside one of the new homes, and listened to the story of the widow and the great storm. He carried that story with him to other outposts, to other new settlements springing up on the vast plains. The tale of Ilara's folly became a piece of frontier legend, but the name was no longer a mockery. It was a title of respect. The idea of the earth-walled house, the masonry stove, and the rawhide window spread, not as a command from an expert, but as a simple, powerful story of survival. In distant valleys and on other windswept plains, settlers who had never met Ilara began to build differently, adapting her ideas, saving their families from the same fate that had almost claimed the people of Prairie Ridge. Years later, Ilara, now a respected elder in a thriving, secure community, would sit outside her home on a warm summer evening and watch the children, her own Samuel among them, now a tall young man, play in the tall grass. The settlement was no longer a precarious foothold on a hostile land. It was a home. The low, grassy roofs of the houses dotted the landscape, their small windows glowing warmly as the sun went down. They were a testament not to a single person's genius, but to a community's ability to learn, to change, and to embrace a wisdom that came from the most unexpected of places. The greatest strength, they had all learned, was not in the rigid adherence to tradition, but in the humble willingness to admit that a better way was possible. It was a lesson learned in the heart of a merciless winter, a truth discovered in the quiet warmth of a house built not of pride, but of earth, ingenuity, and a mother's fierce love.